Well, thank you very much, and thank you for giving me the opportunity of coming here this afternoon and sharing some of our thoughts from London on some of the issues that are facing. Sorry about that. Some of the issues that are facing us, and I hope sharing some of our thought processes, which might be of interest to you. The first thing. Oh, bear with me a minute. Not moving. Right, I have to. Right. A few bits of background. We are now in an era, as you all know, of cities. Most of the world now live in cities. There was a moment in time when we were in the country. We've now all come to cities. Cities are growing at an enormous rate. And cities are undoubtedly very much the drivers of the economy, wherever they are. And big cities in particular drive the economy. Just to put a little bit of London context to this, there was some work done on the number of cities out there. And some work was done looking at the top 600 cities. And the most interesting thing about the top 600 cities is that over the next 10 years, 116 of those will actually drop off the list, and 116 new ones will go onto the list. And most of those new ones are in South America, in Africa, in Asia, and the ones dropping off are in North America, in Europe, and those sort of areas. And this change is underway, and you see this particularly in Europe, where much of Europe is getting older, and populations are declining. But not so in London. London is going very, very differently. London is growing. And this is also true about the economy. The economy is tilting eastwards, and this slide just picks up something you all know, that so much of the world's economy is being driven from this part of the world. And therefore, you do need, as a city, to recalibrate yourself against that background. A little bit of context for London. How big is London? Well, this is basically our GVA, but as you can see, London is actually bigger than countries like Belgium, Switzerland, Sweden. It's a bigger economy. It's a bigger economy than Scotland or Wales, and we recently went through a process in the UK of looking whether Scotland should actually devolve from Great Britain and should become a separate country. And it just gives you some context of its size. It is about half the size of London in GVA terms. So London is a city which does generate enormous amounts of revenue and is an increasingly important economic driver. What we sat down as a city was to try and look at ourselves and look at what were our strong points, what were our weak points. What did we have to do as a city going forward to sustain our position as a world-leading city, sustain our economic position, and to sustain the sort of population growth? And so we were looking at all these obvious areas that affect a city, whether it be connectivity, whether it be congestion, whether it be housing. We put all of these things together. We had the experience of the Olympics, and it's worth just going back to that, not in the sense of a set of games, which I think you will agree were all pretty successful and pretty good, but what it did to the city. We made a very conscious decision to build the Olympic Park in the poorest part of the city. We also built it in an area which was heavily contaminated, an area which had low employment, had the health prospects of those that lived there were poor. Everything about it was a poor part of the city. Londoners all believed that the Olympics was a great disaster before it actually took place. And there was constant criticism about the budgets, constant criticism about the process. But once, of course, we had the Olympics, everybody said it was a great success, and why did we do it more often? So, you know, depends where you are on these things, whether you... but it also united London, and it made Londoners start to think about the whole city, because we were very much polarised. You know, it was the centre and the west, which was where the wealth was. The east was poorer, and it was just not such a successful area, and that changed all that. And it actually started to make the city work much better as a unit. So, what does London actually needs? Well, and I'm going to go into this in some detail, but what we did was we decided we have two planning documents that we have to produce. Firstly, we have a strategic plan. This is a land use document. It's a pretty typical land use document, which many of you in this audience would recognise. It's the sort of thing which says where you see the population growing, how do you see it being built, where you see the industrial land, where you see the commercial land, you know, all of that. That was all clearly laid out. But what it didn't really do was pick up the infrastructure needs that go with it. So we therefore developed an infrastructure plan. Now, unlike our strategic plan, which is a very heavy document, it's a heavy document to read, and it is a very legal document because it has to go through public inquiry, it is inspected, it's consulted upon in enormous detail, and people go over it line by line. The infrastructure plan is a much lighter document. It is much more opportunistic, in the sense it can be changed very, very quickly if we need to, because we've actually got to be able to move much faster. So that's why we put this document together, which I'm going to go through in some detail. And in writing it, we asked ourselves 4 questions, and I think they're very important questions. What do we actually need as a city? What is essential to us if we're growing at the sort of rates we are growing at? Where will it all go? How will we deliver it? And the last exam question, the hardest one of all, how on earth do you pay for it? And we've tried to answer all 4 questions, because for us, the last question is the all-important one. I think in times gone by, it was all very easy. You went along to central government, whoever was the government of the day, and said, we need this. You then spent a few years arguing about it, and a few years later, you might end up with the money to build it. And that was how it worked. Well, we can't live like that anymore. Firstly, the government hasn't got the money that it used to have. And secondly, we can't wait for some of this to just grind their way through a process. So we have to find other ways of paying for things. And that's why that last all-important question is in here, and why everything leads up to that question. We then started to say, what do we need? What should we be looking at as a city? It's easy to talk about housing, it's easy to talk about transport. We're the transport authority, so we should know what the transport needs of the city are. We should be able to write that very accurately. We know what's happening to the population. We should be able to work that one out. But it's not so easy for us to do things like the green industries. What do we actually need? We're not responsible for electricity, yet if the lights go off, I can tell you now that the mayor will get the blame for it. We aren't the gas authority to handle the gas supplies for London. Yet again, if nobody's got any heating in the winter, you can guess where that complaint will go. Water. Well, after our last winter, water wouldn't seem to be a problem to anybody, as we had more of it than we could ever cope with. But water in the long term is a big problem for the city, and so on. So we started to look at these other areas, and perhaps the hardest one of all was connectivity, and the whole issue of high-speed broadband and things like this, which, if you like, are the new utilities. They're not the traditional ones, they're the new ones that are coming, and I'm sure there'll be things we haven't even thought about yet. So, our key findings. The first one is really about transport. For me, transport is the biggest one. If you get the transport right, all the other things will get themselves sorted out. If you don't get the transport right, you are in deep trouble, and there's no question about it. Transport opens up the city. It opens up the land use. It is a driver of prosperity. It's a driver of change. And of course, above all, we're a city like ours, where we are, as I say, we have a population of 8.5 million people, but we have about 9 million people coming into the city each day. Gives you some idea just how important the way the transport system is for us. So the first thing is to look at our metro lines, and that's that top drawing, which you probably can't really see terribly well. It doesn't matter. What we tried to sort of show on there is what parts of the rail network will actually cease to be functionable because they'll become overcrowded. And what do we have to do as a result of that? What mechanisms do we have to put in place? Well, the first is the most obvious one, and the cheapest, of course, is to actually get them so that you actually get a train every 2 minutes on those lines. And that was the first driver. And we've already done that on the Jubilee line, which is one of our metro lines. Every 2 minutes, a train comes along. We have to do that for the rest of it. But that's about automation of signalling systems. It's about driverless trains, because I'm afraid individual drivers are too slow now for what we need. It's about selling the idea of driverless trains to people who don't actually trust them unless they see a driver sitting in the cab, even though most of the drivers of trains today, all they do is push a button and the train moves, or they may open the doors. But, you know, we've got to make that shift. So it's about that, and that is an enormous investment. It's about our new east-west rail link called Crossrail, which is bringing trains from the east of London and pushing them through to the west of London. And that's £14.5 billion of investment. What's that in dollars? It's you know, not far shy of about $30 million. So you can see that these are massive sums of money that are having to be used. We have a Crossrail 2 we need to put in. We have extensions to rail lines. These are all the things that we need in transport. But it's driven by that little top drawing at the top there, which shows the congestion levels on the network and at what point the network ceases to function. And that would be a very severe problem to the city. Moving on to other parts of transport other than rail. London has always been a westward-facing city. And on the western side, we have plenty of river crossings. It's very easy to get across the river. Onto the east of the city, we basically have got a crossing really on the edges of the eastern side of the city, and we've got a couple of tunnels. That's it. And guess what? They're all congested all of the time because we just don't have the crossings. And so it's about opening up the river. And when we first started this exercise, back in 2007, there was a proposal from City Hall for just one extra bridge. Everybody said, that's terrible because all the congestion will come into my area. So nobody wanted it. So there was this massive campaign against it, or rather a massive campaign by all the residents and a massive campaign by all the companies who wanted it because they couldn't get their goods across the river. Now, in the infrastructure plan, we don't talk about one bridge. We talk about a tunnel, we talk about 2 bridges, and we talk about another crossing well to the east and well outside London to try and relieve traffic from even coming into London. So we now talk about something much more elaborate, and guess what? It's much more sellable as a result. And that's one of the lessons we learned, is you've got to have a big picture to try and sell to people, not try and sell them a little bit of it. You have to sell all of it to them so they can actually see what you're doing. I think this is also a little bit about spreading the pain. They all want to see their neighbours suffer just as much as they're going to suffer. And it's so we started to put all that together, and this is quite big. And then the bottom drawing, which again is a whole mass of red dots. But this is our road network, and all those red dots is where it is going to be totally unmovable, and you will not get a car through it, however hard you try. It is where the city will just jam up completely. So what do you do at each of those red dots? What is the solution to the problem? It may be you put a tunnel underneath, maybe you stop the cars going there in the first place. There will be a solution, and it's about an attempt to try and analyse that solution. And so this is what this is about in transport terms. But it's also about the green bit. London is a fabulously green city. If you go to any of the really tall buildings that are in London and you look down, even in the poorest parts of the city, you will see greenery. It is very green. It's very open. It's one of the really nice things about the city. And we need to preserve that and keep that, and we try to pick this up. We have wonderful parks, open spaces, all of that. So how do we supplement that? How do we increase the amount of green space that we've got? How do we make sure that we preserve all the things that are nice about the city while we're growing the population? And so we try and start answering that very difficult question. And one of the most interesting things, a bit of work we did, was we went out trying to ask investors why they invested substantial sums of money in London. And of course they came back with some of the answers you'd expect: rule of law, the economy, things like this, the English language, fairly obvious things. But then came the surprise to us. It was about, and it's also about the parks, the open spaces, the bars, the restaurants, the museums, the theatres, the cultural things. And they actually were massive drivers of cash into the city. They were one of the reasons people were willing to invest in the city, why people wanted to live in the city. So it isn't just a nice to have, all this. It is actually an essential ingredient to the whole thing. I put this one in, this slide, because it's always a bit of a surprise to people. This is our digital connectivity. And basically, wherever you see the red blob on there, means that you aren't going to get any decent broadband. And unfortunately, on this kind of scale, it picks up the problem. But if you actually drill down into this map in a lot more detail, you'd find a lot more bits of red would start to show up. And the argument we're now running is that for a building, you need electricity, you need water. But we're now arguing you need connectivity as well. It is actually an essential utility. And without that, the building is actually worthless. Now, how do we get that kind of connectivity in place? And we're still wrestling with this at the moment. And if I came back here in a year's time, I might have an answer for you. But at the moment, it's still a difficult question. Because it's about, it's partially a function of the market. It's partially a regulatory issue. It's very complicated because it's not just about availability, it's about affordability and deliverability and these other things. And so it's quite a complex thing to work through. And I think where we're heading is that we're heading towards a certification system for buildings, so that you will be a 5-star building. That means you've got decent connectivity. And we will try and create a market which brings pressure to bear on the suppliers to actually deliver that connectivity that's needed. And this, by the way, is a problem not for big companies, ever. This is never a problem for big companies or government, because they can always pay the bill. This is a problem of small companies, SMEs, and about individuals, because, of course, so many of us work from home. It's about that. But it gives you some idea of the sort of challenges we were trying to pick up. Energy. Well, this is a pretty severe problem for us in London at the moment. And the trouble is, in the UK in general, we've been closing down coal-fired power stations. We've been closing down nuclear-powered stations. We've been building wind farms, doing all these things. But the trouble is, you get a new large building. The largest building in London is the Shard. Now it's the tallest building. That actually has the electricity consumption of a small town. And I don't know what it would be like here in Singapore, but I bet it would be exactly the same because you've got even more air conditioning than we have. You know, new buildings do, however energy efficient they are great electricity users. So it's about finding alternative ways of dealing with this problem. It's partially about supply, it's partially about distribution. We've actually calculated we need 6 more substations, we need certain recabling works, and we've put a bill to that. By 2020, it's about £300 million. So it's not a small bill, just to deal with some of the distribution issues. And it's about, of course, having more localized energy producers as well. It's a whole range of things, but again, it just shows you that we've looked at the issue. And then water, not a problem today, as I say. We managed to have flooding, so it can't be a problem. But the trouble is, it is a problem, because we are running out of water, and we've got to find other ways of getting water into the city. And this could well be using something like the canal networks that we've got to actually bring water into the city. By that means, it is about better use of trying to get hold of groundwater. It's about doing different things. But it is, and certainly by 2050, will be a problem if we don't take action about it. I might add that if we've got a problem, so has everybody else. And then it's about the green industries. How do you get them? Now, we're a long way off sorting this one out. We've stopped all landfill of rubbish, but we haven't. I mean, we are now one of the biggest exporters of rubbish to Holland. There is something slightly illogical and not very green about filling boats full of rubbish and sailing them across the North Sea to another country to get rid of them. But that shows you the sort of problems that we actually have, and we have to put that right. And our ambition is to be totally sustainable within the city. So we do process all our own rubbish within the city. We do recycle everything that goes through. We do have the plants that recycle the plastics, that recycle the metals, that recycle, you know, the papers, whatever. So, and that's all about this piece. And we've ourselves established our own Green Industries Park to try and encourage new developers to come in with new projects, new schemes, new plants. And we're constantly looking at ways of doing it. But again, we've tried to quantify all that. So next steps. We have 4 big spatial scenarios which we have. We have, firstly, our current situation, which is the red one. Which is very much about growth in the centre of the city and in opportunity areas. We've identified around the city 38 opportunity areas. These are pieces of the city which, for whatever reason, the property market in its various booms has passed by. It just hasn't gone there. And it may be a problem of transport. It may be a problem of contamination of land. It may be a problem of the sort of land ownerships that are in play. It could be all sorts of things. It's probably all of these things. But there are areas of the city which can take enormous densification, can take enormous numbers of people, but are not being built out without us doing something about it. So it's about how do we correct whatever it is that needs to be corrected. The blue scenario is a variation of this, but it's also part of our policy, which is, why do we have stations in the middle of areas where there's basically nobody living? They happen to have been built because at some point in the past, somebody thought it was a good idea to have a station there, and then we built sports fields around them, all a bit illogical. Or they may have a lot of factory units around them. So this is about what could you do to make better use of your existing transport network to actually utilize it properly. And that's the bit. So it's about the transport nodes. And the other one is, for us, and I think this may be more of a London problem than it is here in Singapore, but I'm not sure, is of course the changing pattern of shopping, which is changing very, very fast. We've got 150 town centres in London, and some of them are very successful, the big ones, the Oxford streets or the big international shopping centres, the big malls. They're fine. They just can withstand the economic winds quite well. The very small ones are fine because it's largely about convenience shopping. It's mainly food driven. They're okay. The ones in the middle are, for us, in deep trouble. The business is going away from them and going away from them fast. They're too big, they're too long, the shops that are in there are the wrong shape and size, their floor plates are too small. And they often are at transport nodes as well. So the opportunity there for us is very simple. It is we need to truncate them, reduce them in size. We need to, they should be the centres for the nighttime economy. They're also great places for the old and the young to live. The young because they want to be in the centre, and the old because they increasingly want to downsize. They want to go somewhere more convenient. And they certainly don't want to live in the middle of the countryside. They actually want to be in the town centre. So they're great places, not for families, but they're great places for the other groups to go to. And it's a great opportunity of really getting density, which is the blue scenario. Well, it's a bit of a mixture of the blue and the green scenario, which is, as I say, the increasing densities. And then the last one, of course, is about taking the population outside London completely and starting to grow outside London. And this is about new towns, garden city suburbs, new areas. There's a word of caution I always feel about this. Back in 1944, there was a town planner in London called Abercrombie, and he wrote a plan for London called the Abercrombie Plan. And the gist of the Abercrombie Plan, and it was a very good document, but the bit I want you to take away from it was about big cities were not sustainable. They were not drivers of the economy. They were actually, you'd be better off reducing the population of those big cities and spreading the population around. So there was a policy then by the British government for nigh on 30 years, or more like 40 years, of moving the population out of the big cities. And they built garden city suburbs, which were nice and pretty and cleaner and nicer places to live than the sort of rather built up inner London sort of scenario. And in the sense that they were probably clearing away very poor housing stock. That was probably a wise move to make. But the truth of the matter was that people went out at that stage. But at the first opportunity, they all came back. People actually like to live in the city. They don't really want to live outside the city. It's not where people want to go. So you're actually bucking the market. And that's a very dangerous thing to be doing. One, because it's possibly going to cost you a lot of money. And secondly, there's no guarantee it's going to work. So the scenario is there. And we've looked through the scenario. And of course, some of that scenario we will need to implement over the next few years. But it is not the preferred direction. The preferred direction is to absorb our population growth within the city's boundaries. So that's about more density, and it's about a different type of living. It's about how do we deliver all this? Well, one of the lessons I think we've learned is that we can't do it on our own anymore. And although we might not be responsible for some of these things, like electricity, we actually need the electricity providers in the room with us. And so therefore we started to look more and more at an infrastructure delivery group where we actually bring these people in. And it's in their interests to work with us. It's in our interests to work with them because we get the blame anyway. So it's about trying to work together much more sensibly and sharing information Some of it's quite sensitive commercial information, or they see it as sensitive commercial information. I don't think it's that sensitive. If the lights go out, then you know there's a problem. I mean, it's pretty simple, really, and they'll get a lot of stick for it. It's about trying to get cross-political support for the kind of developments we need. The trouble is, when you're building large transport networks, when you're putting together any of these big schemes, there is a problem for a lot of people. They don't like it. I don't know what it's like here in Singapore, but generally what the message seems to be is, when are you going to build more homes for my children so they can get a home? Don't you dare build them near me. That's basically the message. It's quite a balancing act, this. So we actually need to try and get more political support for the schemes. A good example of that was our Crossrail network, which I mentioned earlier. That was in planning for a number of years. It started off when it was first put forward as a scheme. Everybody said, that's a great idea. Then the government thought, oh, this might actually get through. So the officials in the Department of Finance and the Treasury Department said, let's look at a more cost-effective scheme. Instead of having one going east-west, let's have one going north-south. That must be better. Let's spend a few years looking at this. And then that was done. And as long as they could keep that alternative on the table, they didn't have to make a decision about the east-west one. Anyway, finally, after years of arguing, we get the east-west one agreed by the last government. Then the government changed, and the new government comes in. And so the first thing the new government says, we're going to scrap this because we want to save some money. Now, the only way we stopped it being scrapped was because we were actually able to motivate all of London, all the political parties in London, all the businesses, everybody to say, no, we've got to have this, and build such a campaign up that it stayed. And that taught us a lesson. It also taught government a lesson, actually, that these big infrastructure schemes, you've got to get a fair degree of public support for them. You've got to get cross-political support. You cannot afford it to become a football match between political parties, or you are in really deep trouble getting them through. They're hard enough to get through anyway. You can't afford that kind of battle. So it's now about trying to get agreement. And indeed, the government, we're doing a high-speed rail link from London to the north of England at the moment, which is going through the legal processes. And it's very controversial because nobody likes it if you happen to live near it. But because it has got complete cross-party political support, there is nowhere for the opposition to go with it. It's getting through. And it's the same for us with these infrastructure plans. We've got to get that kind of support with everybody. Some of our problems are regulatory at the end of the day. Things like electricity or refuse. There's plenty of commercial companies, probably some in this room, who'd rush forward tomorrow and build it, provided the regulatory framework is right. It's quite clear our regulatory framework is not right. Otherwise, the market would start to correct it. So what do we need to do with that? And then it's about more fiscal devolution. We have a problem in London that we don't keep all the taxes that are raised in the city that we wish we could. But we don't keep enough of them. And we're not looking for more money for revenue purposes. We're not trying to increase our spending on revenue. We are trying to increase our expenditure on capital infrastructure. So it's the ability to borrow. And that's more about continuity of funding. What we have difficulty with is a series of cycles of governments. As governments come in, they have grand plans, and we get money off them, and at the end of their time, you have a general election, and all the money runs out until the next government arrives. You get some more money. And everybody says, well, why do you have this start-stop policy? Well, it's because we haven't got any money. We need it constantly. We need a constant flow. So we're not after more money. We're just after the money that's there, which we're going to get anyway. Just let us have it. all the time. Don't keep turning it on and off. And then we can borrow, then we can sort ourselves out. And it's that continuity, so that's a really big issue. And this is really some of our cost estimates, which are eye-watering. Now, I should stress, and you can't thankfully see the numbers terribly well, because they are absolutely amazingly high. But the point of it is that not all of this would ever be our money. It's about finding other means of paying for things. We're in the process of building at the moment a rail line in an area called Nine Elms. It's a little piece of central London, which is very badly supported by transport. In that area, we're having to extend a metro line by 2 stations. It's an underground line. And that's costing us about £1 billion to build this. So it's pretty expensive. And the government have always made it clear they haven't got any money. So how do we pay for this? Well, this is actually the first bit of new railway in London completely paid for by the private sector since the Channel Tunnels. And even that wasn't in London, but it shows you how long ago it was we did something. We're paying for it out of a combination of an infrastructure levy on all development, which is about trying to capture a little bit of the property uplift in values that are there because of a station. So we're capturing that. And in return to the developer, we're giving the developer density, which he wouldn't normally have. So it's a bit of a win-win for everybody. So we're trading, as I say, transport for density. And then we've also capturing the business rates. We have a system of business rates. Businesses always pay a certain amount of money for the land they occupy. And we're capturing the uplift on that because of new development land. And the combination over a 25-year period enables us to borrow the sort of monies that we need. And that is the model we're beginning to use more and more as we talk about other bits of rail infrastructure. How do we capture some of that property uplift? And as I say, it's a bit of a trade-off with density. And that's how much of that will be paid for. It's also through other mechanisms. I mean, things like a new airport are, of course, entirely private sector funded. So they're all there. And this is about the funding mechanisms that I've just talked about. But it is about a new world of funding. We have to think about things in an entirely different way to anything that we've done before. So I think I've really tried to cover, and this slide just really picks up a series of the key decisions. But I do come back to the one I mentioned at the beginning. It is about transport. Transport is the single biggest driver for the city. If we get the transport right, and we put transport in the right place, the trouble is transport is expensive. You can get the housing, you can get the densities, you can do all the other things, but you've got to get that transport in place. So I hope that those few slides actually picks up the vision we have, and I hope that was of some interest to you.
The first of among the 3 things is the bold 2020 vision that you have to make London the greatest city on earth. After listening to you, I thought we should change our vision statement in URA. Ours was to make Singapore a great city to live, work, and play. But in London, they aspire to be the greatest city on earth. The second thing that made a very deep impression was your very clearly articulated infrastructure plan from now to 2050. And third was your very clear idea of what needs to be done going forward. And in planning, we know that such clarity of vision does not come easily, and especially when you know that you have to implement it and make it happen. And the question that I thought I would start just by way of kickstarting this discussion is, in your work planning for the city in the long term, especially for a city like London with such great ambition, what is your greatest challenge?
I think yes, it is on. Yes. I think the greatest challenge that we face is a fiscal one at the end of the day. Everything comes back to the money, as I said at the beginning. And infrastructure is expensive. It has long payback periods. That's one of the reasons we had to always look at 2050 as being the sort of timeline for any kind of infrastructure plan, because most schemes take about 25 years to fund, to pay back, and to get them to a reasonable economic state. So you are having to look quite a long way in the future when you're doing any of your calculations. And I think the big challenge is to get people to recognise, certainly for us in a city like London, that if London catches a cold, the whole country suffers. It isn't just London that suffers. But of course, the view in much of the rest of the country is you spend too much money in London, don't spend anything in London. It needs to be spent in other parts of the country. And we have that tension. I think that's true in many places which have got a large hinterland to them. And it's a very difficult argument to run all the time. It's quite a serious argument. But it is about that continuity of funding, which I talked about at the end. You've got to be able to fund these things. And without it, we really will be in trouble. Because if we don't get the transport, we won't be able to get the densities that we need. We won't be able to get the housing that we need at affordable prices. And if we can't do that, the businesses will start to suffer and they'll go elsewhere. They may all come to Singapore. You know, we actually have to... sorry, I do joke. But, I mean, it's serious. I mean, we're in a worldwide economy. People can go anywhere. And people with real skills can go anywhere. They're very, very mobile. And you've got to try and hang on to those people, hang on to those businesses. And that's about having the right kind of city. Just as an aside, when we're measuring ourselves, you'll be pleased to hear this, when we measure ourselves, we actually don't measure ourselves against any other European city at all. We actually look at Singapore, Hong Kong, New York. Seriously, those are the cities you have to look at for us. We're not worried what happens in Paris or something. We're just not worried. But we are worried what happens in Singapore.
And I thought listening to you, one great advice that I took from your presentation earlier was the importance of getting community support to have that support for continuity of funding. And as a planner like you who is always looking for money, I thought that was a very good advice. Well, on this note, I thought I should open the floor to questions now. Yes, please.
Okay, I think this is working. Hi, Sir Edward. My name is Edwin. I'm a planner with the Urban Redevelopment Authority. But in a previous life, I used to work for Caroline Pigeon on the London Assembly. I found it interesting that you didn't really talk about housing in much detail. I have a question for you about the draft London plan that just recently went through a public examination. If I understand it correctly, based on the current London Strategic Housing Market Assessment, you need 48,800 dwelling units a year from 2015 to 2025 to meet your current housing needs. The current London plan target in your latest draft is 42,000. I was wondering why there's a 6,000 dwelling unit shortfall in your current plans.
Yes. The answer to it is actually very simple. Our last London plan, just to explain, our London plan is our statutory planning document for the whole city. It is a legal document which actually sets housing targets and everything else. So it goes through a very complex legal process for acceptance. Our last London plan was based upon some previous estimations of population, and we were planning on always about 32,000 units of housing a year. I must tell you, we've never ever built 32,000 housing units, ever. That's not true. In 1934, it's slightly, rather a long time ago, we built 80,000 units. And we built 80,000 units then when we didn't have the benefit of a planning system. or indeed a green belt around the city or anything else. You could almost build what you wanted, where you wanted it. But I think we've moved on from that stage. So we've never ever built the kind of numbers that we want. We've averaged Now, faced with that, we then went out as part of the process of doing our plan and trying to do an estimate of what we could build from sites that we could identify. Our opportunity areas, which I described to you, the 38 opportunity areas, sites that were in the planning system for one reason or another, sites that may not have come forward but we know about. And we were able to clearly identify for the next 10 years 42,000 units a year. And that's why we set our targets for 42,000, not at the number we actually want of 49,000. And it was really a practical one. If we've never ever built much above 25,000, what's the point of saying our new target is 49,000 with no hope of ever getting there? It was more sensible to try and pick a number where we thought we might stand a chance of actually building it. Now, we are completely crazy because we do actually think we can find a difference between 42 and 49,000 because partly sites we don't know anything about, partly greater densities on some of the sites we've already got, particularly if you put transport in, could you change the density matrix a bit? Partially because of what I said about town centres changing, and we think there's an awful lot of land use there that we can draw upon. So we do think we can make the difference between 42 and 49. But that was the logic behind everything we did. I might add this year, I think we'll be one of the highest, obviously we're one of the highest completion rates ever, but highest in starts. We could well be not far short of 40,000 starts this year. So we are actually really ramping up production. And if any of you are regular visitors to London or have been to London recently, it is quite a sea of cranes around the place as we have ramped up housing an awful lot. In the planning system at this moment in time, we've got planning approvals out there for about 200,000 units. So we have got about 4 years supply of housing, if you like, actually with planning permission. I'm not saying it's all being built. There's a world of difference between having planning permission and actually having it under construction, but it shows the capacity is there. So that was the thinking behind it. But our target is as I say, 49,000, 50,000 is where we really have to be if we're going to get the kind of housing numbers that we need.
So what was the key obstacle that is standing in the way of your housing program? Listening to you, is it shortage of land or is it shortage of funding? Apart from the fact that there's a planning process that is standing in the way.
I think there's a number of things. I wish I could say there was a magic bullet somewhere that we can actually use. I think it's a number of things. I think it's firstly the planning system is too slow, and that's a little bit of us. It's also our legal framework, which is a very slow one. It's partly because of the protection land has, and the way people will quickly go to judicial review at the slightest opportunity, and that's a long process, and that slows things down. There's a whole series of things like that. And both us and the government are trying to speed that up. And that's not about one big thing, it's about lots and lots of small changes to the process without weakening the democratic accountability, which is so important. So there's that. There is a land use issue about who owns what land. And funnily enough, the guilty party here is not the developer. By and large, developers build out. I won't say build it out as soon as they've got it, but they will build it out in phases relatively quickly over a 3-4 year period. They do build out, mainly because they've got fiscal issues if they don't. It's other people. Government is a particular problem. They sit on land. Local authorities sit on land. And there's a degree of land speculation out there. Which is actually reducing a bit, but it is still an issue. So land supply is part of it. And then I think the other one is not enough developers. We suffered badly in 2008 when the property crash took place. Most of the big companies, they were fine. They just weathered the storm. They reduced in size and then came back again once the market picked up. But a lot of the small companies went out of business. And we lost a whole raft of small developers, small construction companies. And many of them just went into the business of building roof extensions or digging somebody's basement out or doing something else. And we've got to get them back into the market. But the trouble is, it's difficult getting them back into the market, and this is a planning problem, because it's so expensive to go through planning, because you have to produce the drawings, you have to sort out all your consultation, everything else. So for many of them, think, oh, I can't be bothered to do this on a small site. So that's a problem. So it's a long answer, but it's not one thing, it's lots of different things. But what we're trying to do is just pick away at this as much as we can in each area.
Thank you. Can we have a next question?
My name is Satya. I'm from KPMG. Sir Edward, thank you for the very insightful presentation. My question is relating to that slide you put up on the funding challenges. And you talked about fiscal devolution. Now, we live in Singapore, and we are fortunate to have the city and the state pretty much as one unit. Whereas, like you, a number of developing countries which have large cities with significant hinterland are unable to divert their growing city resources to develop infrastructure. What are you actually doing in London to do that? Because I think that has very instructive lessons for a number of our Asian large cities as well. So if you can share that, that'll be very helpful.
I think it's actually about trying to raise more of this money ourselves, on the one hand, and on the other, persuading government they have to change. Let me deal with the last one first. We've been through a fairly painful process of a national debate about part of the United Kingdom breaking away, Scotland leaving the Union. And in the end, they decided they didn't want to do that. But on the way, they have managed to secure very significant devolution of powers away from our central government at Westminster. The UK is very much dominated by central government. It controls the expenditure much more than in many other places. And our share of taxation, which we can keep as a city, is quite low. So this is about, and it's not just a London argument, this is an argument for all the UK cities, well, other than the Scottish ones who've won this battle, is about keeping more of our tax revenues within the city. And as I said earlier when I was speaking, it's not about spending money on revenue issues, other than the fact that you need revenue to pay for capital, but it's not about running costs of the city, it's about the capital infrastructure of the city. That's what we need the cash for. And that's what we want continuity of, because then we can borrow. So that's part of the answer to this. It's about having sufficient revenues coming in. And we're not asking anybody to have any tax increases. We just really want to take almost what we get now from government, but we want it on a permanent basis. It so happens that if you do a calculation in London, all our property taxes roughly equal what it costs to run the city. So why don't you just give us all those property taxes? Very simple argument. Government doesn't like it very much, but it's a very simple argument. And that's the argument we run. But the second half of this is, I think it's also about finding other methods of paying for it. And I think this is actually the bigger challenge. We've got to capture, all of us have got to capture, some of the benefits which are out there when you put in major infrastructure. And I don't think any of us have been very good at capturing the benefits for the public purse. I think we've been very poor at capturing those benefits. I think the private sector has been very good at capturing it. And you could argue they've taken the risk, why shouldn't they? But I'm not saying we want all of it, but we want some of it. We've done some calculations that if you have a property near a railway station, that's worth about 10% extra in property value. Well, we'd like some of that. It's as simple as that. And we want that to pay for more transport. So that's the argument that we're running. So it's about finding other ways. It's about, as I say, the business increases as you get more businesses in, as the city grows. Now, I do appreciate there is another side to this. If, of course, you have a reduction in business, you lose money. So it's actually a very good argument for business, this, because it makes the city very pro-business, because they can't afford the businesses to, in any way, slow down. So it's quite good pressure. But it's about trying to capture some of that money and trying to capture some of that to actually build this. And that's what we're about. It's about new ways, innovative ways, quite, in our terms, quite revolutionary ways of trying to raise that cash.
Well, despite that difficulties, I must say I have to commend you on looking at your plans that you're still putting in quite a bit of resources to invest in parks and protecting biodiversity. And these are the kind of intangibles that will be very hard to quantify, I suppose.
Well, it is hard to quantify, but I think if we don't do it, I come back to my earlier comment, you know, if we cough, the rest of the country gets a cold. That's what will happen in London. So we've got to keep, I would actually argue what I was showing to you is not something anybody has a choice over. I think the choice you have is, do you do it quickly and efficiently, or do you do it slowly and pay a price on the way? I think that's the debate you have. I don't think there's a choice.
Thank you. Can we have the next question?
Hi, my name is Joyce from URA. Thank you for your insightful presentation, Sir Edward. I have two questions here. Firstly, I understand that the UK will allow driverless cars on public roads from January next year, like in California, Nevada, and Florida. So autonomous vehicles are seen to actually make cities both safer and greener. So what were some anticipated problems prior to permitting this autonomous vehicles on ground? And what were some mitigation solutions put in place? Yeah. And my second question is, one of the scenarios listed in your presentation slides was to expand outwards of central London. So I understand that one of the projects ongoing, Suburbia project, yeah, so it explores the urban intensification in outer London, which could contribute to an increase in housing supply and reduce congestion. So how would you address community groups' concern as they may see this effort by the government as potentially garden grabbing? Thank you.
Two quite difficult questions, really. Let me deal with the first one. We have a problem in London that we do have the quality of air and the pollution levels are high, and that's a problem, and it's one that we have to deal with, and much of that is being driven actually by vehicles. They're the biggest single cause of pollution in London now, particularly diesel vehicles of one sort or another, which of course are buses and trucks. And what you have when you've got a big building program, lots of trucks. So in a way, we're a victim of our own success in air quality terms. So what we've been moving towards is reducing or rather increasing the taxation that larger vehicles pay, particularly cars. So that's actually underway at the moment. We're also trying to phase out diesel vehicles as much as we can, particularly in areas like taxis, which are quite high polluters, and trying to set targets for improvements and set targets for people to change vehicles. And you have to do that over a fairly long-term period because a lot of these are small businesses. So you can't just suddenly stop people using their vehicles. It's got to be planned in a careful way. So we're doing that. We have been steadily increasing the cost of being able to drive in London. It is very expensive to drive in central London. We have a congestion charge which you pay if you drive into the centre, and we charge you a lot of money to park your car. And in new planning permissions, we largely don't let you have any car parks anyway. So, I mean, we're hitting the car every way we can. It is quite a robust policy, which is anti-car. And don't apologise for that. And I think you can only have that policy, of course, if you have decent public transport, by the way. And that's, again, a reason why you've got to have the transport system working properly. People like me, I do not drive to work. I go on the public transport system. So does most people in London, because the transport system is the quickest way of getting from one end of the city to the other. It is the easiest way of getting. It's the fastest. It's not even, I don't even think about it. And I have a car parked outside my house, and unfortunately it's one of the ones which we're trying to ban because it's got a big engine in it. And I keep it more for the fun of it, actually. But it doesn't matter. It doesn't really move very much. Because the public transport system is the preferred route to go. And so I think that's what that's all about and what those policies are about. But as I say, it doesn't make us popular with car drivers sometimes. And the second one, which you... sorry, I'm trying to remember what the second one... Oh, yes, the garden grabbing. This is part of an attempt by both government and ourselves to try and reduce the planning burden on people as much as we possibly can. And it's therefore small house extensions under a certain size. We really don't want them going through the planning system unless we have to. They take a lot of resource. This room is full of planners. As you all know, a small scheme takes as long to do quite often as a big scheme. And we really haven't got the time to spend on some of these very small ones. So we have a much more streamlined system of consultation, which means, provided the neighbours don't all complain, it will go through relatively easily if the neighbours complain slightly differently. But we've tried to reduce the planning burden as much as we can. And it really is about trying to put our resources where they really matter and to put our planning expertise where it matters, on the more significant schemes and the things that really are important to the city. It isn't making a big difference to gardens. It isn't about garden grabbing. It doesn't. Our use framework actually stops that to a large extent. Yes, you can make your house a bit bigger by taking a bit of the garden, but there is a limit to how much you can take. And we don't think it's actually that significant.
Maybe as a short follow-up to the first question on cars, we were very impressed in Singapore where we read 2 months ago that you were allowing autonomous vehicles on roads. How does that fit into your overall car policy?
I don't really know, to be honest. We're about to have the first set of experiments in Canary Wharf with totally automated cars. I think we're going to have to wait and see. I think this is why it's very difficult to write an infrastructure plan to 2050. Nobody's quite sure what tomorrow is going to bring, but it is an interesting one, and I think we're just feeling our way with this. So I think we're just experimenting.
I suppose the message is to be always experimental. Can I have the next question, please?
Hi, I'm Rick from ACOM. I only got one question, and it is simple. So I'm very interested about the funding you try to get from the private developer by giving them a higher FAR and get more fee for the funding for the infrastructure. So my question is, as a design consultant, we're always dealing with a developer and also with the government. So we want to actually help the government to get more funding to invest to the city. I think that's a good way to build a nice city. So my question is, do you have can you explain in detail how do you kind of get more funding from developer, like increase FAR, or do you have another method? Yeah, that's my question. Thanks.
We have in our planning system a section in the Planning Act called Section 106, which basically is about developers' contributions to the local authority as a result of their scheme. So this could be as simple as putting the paving back together again after you've finished building it, or it could be much more significant. It could be about, and we operate differently to yourselves in social housing. As much of our social housing has to be provided by the developer, and we take a certain percentage of most developments towards affordable housing. We just do it differently to yourselves. And so that is part of the Section 106. So it's very much built into the cost model of the development and into the land values. So everybody knows this, and it's a calculation which we have a whole property industry that lives on very successfully. So that's fine. We then, a short while ago, made a variation to it, which was actually asked for by developers. And we introduced a community infrastructure levy. So instead of having this Section 106, which picked up all these things, it's supposed to only pick up both the social housing content and anything very specific to the site, something that absolutely could only be picked up because of that particular building. It's something unique to that building. So we now use that bit of legislation, and we've got a London-wide levy on all property for Crossrail. We actually charge a levy on every development in London towards the Crossrail costs, because it's costing us £14.5 billion, and we've got to pay roughly half of that from non-government sources. So that's coming from the property industry in one form or another. So that's the way we've gone on that one. That's how we do it. It's a very transparent calculation. It applies to absolutely everything. It's not a particularly high sum of money, I might add. These are not big sums. But if you apply it to everything, it becomes quite meaningful quite quickly.
That's a one-time levy always.
It's a one-time, it's entirely a one-time levy. It just takes place as part of the development. And it doesn't matter whether it's commercial or residential, it doesn't matter, it will pick that up. Well, other than actually an individual person's home, they're exempt. It's, you know, if you were extending your home or something, you wouldn't be, it doesn't apply to you, but any kind of development it does. And that's how we use the infrastructure levy. But it's within the funding and in the, basically in the calculations any developer will do. And we set the amounts quite clearly at the beginning. So it works fairly well. And, we want to refine that more now. We want to try and refine that so that people who get a direct benefit pay a bit more. At the moment, it's a rather crude system across the whole city. We now need to concentrate it more on sites which are directly affected by whatever the bit of infrastructure is. So that's a refinement we're working on.
Thank you. Give me the next question.
Sir Edward, Raymond Kwok from kwok.vc.com. Can you share with us, I got two simple questions. Looking at the pictures behind, the Parliament has always been there, and in a sense that, can you give us the planning norm of how many, what is the percentage of a city should be kept historic and how much should be on new buildings? Because I think that in Singapore we have a heritage board which is looking at buildings which should be preserved, but you know, if you don't go to a city, if it's brand new, you might lose some of the historic perspective. Second question is that, what is the percentage of public transport or roads should be in the city? It's just like a vein in the body. You need that for transportation of people, but what should be a planning norm for a good city?
Right. Historic buildings. Well, a bit like you here in Singapore, it's quite hard to preserve everything you want to preserve. We do it in two ways. Firstly, we have certain historic monuments which are very important. The Tower of London, St Paul's Cathedral, the Palace of Westminster. These are really important sites. And we have what we call strategic views. So there are views across there which are absolutely protected. So you can see buildings in London sometimes that look odd shapes. You could well find out that they're on the edge of one of these views, and we've had to chop a bit of the building off. Otherwise, it might get in the view of St Paul's Cathedral or something. So we have a series of things of these which are very, very powerful, and we have a whole view framework which any developer would have to pay attention to, and is very much, it's part of the planning Bible to protect it. Secondly, we have buildings which are of great other historic importance, and they have a listing. We have a system of listing historic buildings. And by the way, historic might not necessarily mean very old. You can be quite a new building and listed, but it's a building of importance. And therefore, I mean, some of the brutal architecture of the 60s has got listings on it so that you can't actually tear it down. There are certain council social housing estates which are actually listed to protect them because they were fine examples of the architecture of the day. Now, with those, they will be listed. Sometimes it'll just be the facade. so you can do what you like inside. And you often see that happening in London. You'll see the facade there and everything behind it ripped down and modernized. Or it may be the whole building's listed. It depends what's inside it. So we have those, and there's quite a bit. And then the third thing we have is that certain parts of London, we just don't think it would be suitable for high rise. And we want to keep the character of the area very much as it is. If you look at the West End of London, you will see it's relatively low rise. Five floors, maybe 6 floors, that's probably your lot. And we will try and do clever things by mansard roofs or something else to at the back of a building where it's not visible. But we're basically keeping them low rise. Other parts of the city, like Canary Wharf or Vauxhall 9 Elms or one of those areas, they're high-rise cities. They're more like Singapore. They're big buildings. And we've tried to keep the high-rise areas together. Our view is that we've got 150, there's 150 towns in London. And we don't see any reason why there can't be 150 different towns. They do not all have to be the same. It is about getting, what's right for that area. And, but again, I do come back to my very earlier point. It is also about we have to get more density out of London. So it is this balance that we strike. So it's that's what we do. But I think, like you, the buildings that are important to us, we do preserve them quite carefully. I was involved with a project the other day, which was going through our planning system, two tall blocks, one of 60 floors, the other was about 50 floors. And there was a very old public house, a bar, sitting between the two. And we've stopped the developer having any thoughts of demolishing it. It's going to sit there alongside those buildings. And we think that's fine. It works. If you looked at it, it works. Because you've got to keep the old and the new. You don't want all the old stuff torn down. It's about a balance. And that's what we try and strike as planners.
In a way, the high-rise city is quite a recent phenomenon in London. I'm just curious to know how are Londoners reacting to high-density living? Because you did mention something quite insightful, that instead of living in a country, most people actually prefer to congregate in cities where things are happening, where there's density.
I think this is a very difficult question. If you look at the history of high-rise in London, or high-rise in Britain, full stop, high-rise was actually associated with social housing. It tended to be social housing developments that were high-rise, private housing developments were low-rise. Bit of a sweeping statement, but generally that was where it went. And high-rise got a very bad name, a bad reputation as a result of that. And particularly when you have large families on high-rise blocks, large numbers of children, they're quite difficult to manage. Some of our social housing landlords were not very good at managing that. So high-rise had a bad reputation. In modern times, and I'm sort of talking the last sort of 10 years really, it's gone the other way. High-rise equals private housing rather than social housing. And of course the quality of the architecture has been that much better as a result of that. There has been some people say, oh, isn't it terrible to build these things? But then when they built them, everybody says they're really nice and you need to list them and keep them. So people's views do change. And now what we try and do, we try and do a blend of private and public ownership to some of these buildings and in its occupation mix. And it is generally popular. It's not popular with families. Still, most London families, if asked, if they had the chance, would have a house with a garden. But you might say, wouldn't we all, given the chance? That's not always possible. So it's always about the art of the possible, this, and what can people actually achieve. But I think we have taken high-rise from being a very poor relation now to being some really good quality architecture and good quality placemaking as well.
Thank you. We probably have time for 2 more questions. So can I have the last 2 questions? Maybe starting from the gentleman there.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation, sir. I'm a visitor from MIT, and I'm here to part of the team that's helping to develop the new Singapore University of Technology and Design. So I'd like to ask you about an issue that I've seen in London, but also I think is relevant to Singapore, and that is the issue that a sizable number of wealthy people invest in various neighborhoods and then don't live there, or they have them as investments, so that you have large areas as between Victoria Station and Sloane Square, which are basically deserted. And to a certain extent, that it seems, to a visitor at least, there a lot of investment here in Singapore is in condominia and other activities which aren't really lived in. So to what extent is that a concern in your planning, and what might you do about how might we think about that issue?
Yeah, it really is, and it's actually quite a hot political subject at the moment, with a lot of myths around it. In our opinion, they're myths. There is this myth that all foreign ownership results in a building being kept half empty, or empty most of the time, which is not the case. Our calculation is that it's about 4% by volume and about 7% by value are being bought by overseas people. It's always difficult to measure this because anybody from the European Union, of course, doesn't get recorded, so our system wouldn't pick them up. So it's probably greater than the percentages I've given in truth. But the fact remains that we don't think it's that big an issue, because the majority of overseas investments in London are people entering parking money in London, and they're going into the buy-to-rent market. They're then renting them out, and the stock is continuing to be used. So it's not a problem to us. Now, in certain parts of London, like Kensington, like Mayfair, yes, there is more of an issue about empty buildings. But I would say to you, it was always thus. It hasn't changed. It was just that it used to be the rich Brit who happened to live in a country house in the middle of the countryside and came up to London every now and again to their townhouse. And it's now occupied by a rich American or a Chinese or a Singaporean or whoever who does exactly the same. It always has been like that in that part of London. It's not a part of London Londoners ever lived in. I'm afraid the prices were always outside most people's reach. And you know, when you're selling houses at £50 million plus, those are not affordable. Let's be blunt about it. You've got to have an awful lot of money for that to be affordable. So I don't think it's quite as big an issue, but it is, of course, being portrayed politically as a big problem. But I think the reality is somewhat different. I think what we're trying to do at the moment is get a better handle on this, and we've looked very closely at it. And I mean, I am aware of cities like, say, Tel Aviv, where they have a system of measuring electricity and water consumption, and if you don't use enough water or electricity, they give you an extra tax, and all sorts of things like this. I mean, it's very hard, you know, before you know where you are, you're going to spend more money collecting the tax than you are actually in what you get. And so our view is we need to get more data, and we are assembling that data at the moment, so we can answer this. But if it is a foreigner coming in and goes into the buy-to-rent market, from our point of view, good news. It's another house which is being occupied by somebody.
Thank you. Okay, we have the last question.
Yeah, good afternoon. I'm Eunice from the National Parks Board. My question is related to what Mr. Ng mentioned about the challenges of greening up a city. So in putting more importance and value of greening the city as a factor to becoming like the greater city, how does your committee in planning cope with the challenges of giving equal or fair attention in development of like parks and nature spaces compared to development of like infrastructure for business and housing? Yeah, thank you very much.
Yes, we regard firstly the greening of an area as just as important as everything else, and we do quite regularly in our master planning build in parks now, particularly on large-scale developments. We will actually force a developer to build in parkland and to open it up. I think the big change that we've made, and it was a mental adjustment as much as a policy one, we had to actually get there in our own thinking, was that all public open space didn't have to be owned by the public. It could be privately owned, but it had to be publicly accessible. And I think we've only reached that view in recent times. And we now quite regularly will persuade developers that they've got to provide good public realm, and it's got to be publicly accessible, and it's an essential part. And our argument back to the developer is, look, it's actually worth your while doing this, because it does give you are able to get a premium off your sale price or your rents as a result of good quality public realm around you. In planning documents, particularly where we're doing new bits of the city, we've used parks as a way of linking developments, so that we've taken an area of land, say we've had a large sort of, I don't know, sort of 25, 38 hectare site or something like that, something sizable. And we've put a park in the middle of it and made all the different developers basically cede some of that land as part of the overall planning for the area, so that we actually get something that both gives us the green open space, which we must have and we need, both for children's play, for just amenity purposes, but also from their point of view as developers, we give back greater density as a net result of that, and enable them to build bigger and higher and get greater density out of it. So it's in their interest, and of course they do get a premium, as I say. So that's how we do it. We do it very consciously, and we have a thing about trees. We just make people put trees in wherever we can. We really do. If you want to take a tree down, we usually make you put about 6 back. Seriously, you don't want to take a tree down. It'll cost you an awful lot. Quite rightly, quite frankly, because we all want all that green space and just want people to preserve it.
We have a thing about trees here as well, but I think we not to the extent, and that's a. Well, next time we make them put back 3. I think we've got time for a last question, if you're okay, because I saw a hand there. Maybe we'll just take one last question before we end.
Good evening, Sir Edward. My name is Frank. I'm from HDB. Sir, you mentioned social housing. So my question is, what types of social housing does London have for the poor population? And how do you fund social housing? And what is the planning for social housing in London? Thank you very much, sir.
I'm not sure if you've got a couple of hours now for this. That's a big question. I didn't really spend a lot of time on housing, but our system is fundamentally different to some other people's. We do not provide much in the way of housing from the state. We just don't go that way. We used to. We've changed in the way we provide it. Most of the money for housing that now comes from government comes in the form of grant or loans, which then go into registered housing providers. And these are basically social landlords of one sort or another. Some of them have come out of local authority housing stock, which they've then taken private, if I can use it that way. They have to still provide it at what we call affordable rents. So it's at a very subsidized rent level. And so we provide grants and loans to them as developers, and most of them have become developers in their own right. And we also draw upon any housing scheme in the city. There is a levy on it for social housing. And we do actually require social housing to be built. Usually about 1/3 of any development is social housing. Sometimes that may take the form of an off-site payment rather than development on-site. But we prefer it on-site as a general preference, because we've got this terrible problem of trying to keep key workers within the city boundaries all the time and to make things accessible. We can't have the bus driver living miles away. We've got to have them living in the city. So we have that, and that produces us, one way or another, about 12,000 units a year of housing come through that system. And that's how we do it. It's a mixture. Some private, some government funded.
Thank you, Sir Edward. I think we have to bring the session to an end. I'd like to thank you for a most insightful and enjoyable session. And I would say, despite all the difficulties that you have highlighted, it does seem to me that you're fully in control and you know exactly what to do.
I think that's rather kind of you. I'm not sure that's necessarily true, but thank you.
Oh, we have to end it. Thank you.
Thank you, Sir Edward and Mr. Ng, for a very insightful and lively session. At this point, I'd like to invite Mr. Ng, our host, to present a token of appreciation to Sir Edward. Mr. Ng, please.